have many distinguished scientists and medical doctors, luminaries in their field. We have many distinguished activists and researchers in the prevention of asbestos-related disease. We have representation from countries around the world, and we're being streamed live to a large audience that can't attend today. So we have a very distinguished opportunity now to hear from a luminary in the field that gets our message out. That is the press. And David McCumber, who is with us today, who was a colleague and a friend of Andrew Snyder, which we mourn his passing this last month, is here to talk to us about his distinguished career in getting that message out through the media. He is currently editor of the Montana Standard, but before that, he was with the Hearst newspaper, was here in Washington, D.C. as director of their office, and has written several books that you can read about in his biography that's listed in the program. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about David, because I think his message over the next 30 minutes as our keynote speaker is going to be fabulous, and one that will resonate with all of you of how important it is to talk to the media, work with the media, to get the message out that asbestos is still with us. In the United States, we still import it, we still use it, we shouldn't. Most of the rest of the civilized world, at least the economically advanced civilized world, does not use it. They ban it. But as Linda talked about earlier today, we are working hard to get the United States to follow suit. Our neighbor Canada, a major exporter of asbestos, has banned it. It's time that we ban it. But we can only ban it if we get our message out. And David, we're very proud and privileged to have you here to give our keynote speech today. Thank you.
First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be with you this week and to be talking with you today. I want to thank Linda and the entire organization for this invitation. I am humbled by what you do and what you endure, and that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. Where are we going? There we are. I'd like to dedicate these remarks to Andrew Snyder, who gave this keynote a decade or so ago. Andy was my journalistic partner and my inspiration. He broke the story of Libby while working with me at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and refused to stop there. Continuing with a searing examination of asbestos around the world in brake shoes, in taconite ore, in talc, in consumer products, even in crayons. More on that a little later. Andy was a wonderful journalist, a two-time Pulitzer winner, and an even better man. I was honored to write An Air That Kills with Andy, and amazed at his work when he later published the updated edition, An Air That Still Kills. I was very happy to get Andy to Montana fairly recently to come to work with me again. But Andy died 5 weeks ago after being diagnosed, very quickly after being diagnosed with a rare and deadly pulmonary disease. Thank you, Andy, for all you did for me and for the people gathered here. Okay, there are all too many places to start this story, but I'm going to begin with the life and needless death of Stephanie Harper. Stephanie died of mesothelioma 2 years ago this month at age 38. I believe she would have turned 40 this week. After enduring constant agony during her years as a young mother, years that should be among the sweetest life has to offer, she died because as a little girl, she loved her daddy. When Ray Bonham would get home from work in Sherman, Texas, Stephanie, as a little tiny girl, would run to him and put her arms around his legs and hug him as hard as she could. In the process, she inhaled asbestos fibers from the handyman's clothing, and you know the rest of the story. That exposure was almost 40 years ago now, and we can all agree how terrible that was. But you know what's worse? Somewhere in Texas right now, there's a little girl welcoming her daddy home who is every bit as much at risk of contracting a horrible, lethal, agonizing disease as Stephanie was back in 1980. In 2007, in the midst of a January blizzard, I sang "Will the Circle Be Unbroken" as the remains of Les Scramstad were laid in the ground in Libby, Montana. The cowhand and country music singer had worked for a year, almost half a century before, at a place called Zonolite, a vermiculite mine owned by W.R. Grace. He paid for that with his life. It was a life painfully degraded by progressive asbestosis, by the diagnoses of his wife and children, and finally ended by mesothelioma, but not before Les fought for what was right for Libby. The vermiculite ore in Libby, as we all know now, was shot through with asbestos, and at one point, the mine managers were so anxious to find an industrial use for the asbestos being wasted in the milling process that they had Les and a co-worker take a pickup load of ore and painstakingly pick by hand all the non-asbestiform material out of it, standing over that pile for days until they had an obscenely pure load of 100% tremolite asbestos that they could experiment with. Of course, the mine had no changing facilities or showers, so Les and his co-workers wore their dusty clothing home, just like Ray Bonham, only more so. Their family cars became asbestos bombs, and those, of course, are some of the reasons why whole families in Libby were wiped out by asbestos-related disease. But there was also the untold tons of that wasted asbestos that were spewed from the dry mill where the ore was processed and carried by the wind into town. All of that is why 400 people have lost their lives in Libby, and thousands more have been diagnosed with asbestos-related disease, and more are getting diagnosed in the impossibly beautiful little Montana mountain town month by month. The deaths of Stephanie and Les are part of the 15,000 asbestos-caused deaths a year in the United States and the nearly 200,000 across the world. In the 10 years since Les died, that's nearly 2 million additional deaths. Every last one of those deaths has something in common with the others besides the deadly fiber. And that's the fact that they were 100% unnecessary and 100% preventable, which is to say that they were caused by corporate greed, the disregard of science, of humanity in the pursuit of profits, and in many cases the disregard of the government's responsibility to regulate industry to protect its citizens, disregard in the shameful pursuit of political favor or financial gain. Linda Reinstein reminded us recently of the quote attributed to Joseph Stalin, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." We are here today because we reject that cynical calculus, the same one lawmakers rely on when they bow to corporate lobbyists and vote against the regulation of asbestos, or for something as disgusting as the Furthering Asbestos Claim Transparency Act, the so-called FACT Act, which should be known as the Alternative FACT Act, a measure designed to make it tough for asbestos victims to get justice and easy for corporate malefactors to escape that justice. We're here because we know the dimension of this tragedy. We are united in grief for the loved ones we've lost, united in determination to fight this disease, and united in activism to fight the corporate and government misdeeds that kill people around the world. How far will this industry go to protect its profits? If there's one thing that stands out about the asbestos industry and the politicians and bureaucrats who do its bidding, it is duplicity, which is not surprising given a business model based on heedlessly endangering untold people. Countless examples of this duplicity exist. I'll touch on just a few. For example, documents show W.R. Grace decided against putting warning labels on its bags of loose fill insulation because it could hurt sales. Internally, the company also meticulously tracked the progress of asbestos-related disease through its workforce with an X-ray program. They even estimated the amount of exposure each miner received, measured in units they called asbestos years, but never shared the results with the miners, instead telling them they were not at risk of disease, that the choking material all around them at that mine and mill was just a nuisance dust. Examples abound. Decades before that, of course, the industry's efforts to conceal the Saranac Lake studies showing asbestos to be a carcinogen are well documented. More deaths, more duplicity. When my partner Andrew Schneider and I discovered through repeated testing that Crayolas contained asbestos, despite carrying the seal of the Art and Creative Materials Institute, declaring them to be safe and non-toxic, manufacturer Binney & Smith trotted out one R.J. Lee, a chemist, who held up a brown crayon at a press conference and said he tested it the day before and found it to be free of asbestos. The next day, because of the kind of reporter he was, Andy Schneider reported that R.J. Lee had been paid more than $7 million by industrial clients to testify against asbestos plaintiffs. Schneider didn't stop there. He went to upstate New York, where the R.T. Vanderbilt Company mined the talc being used in Crayolas. He found dying miners there. He found company literature from the 1940s that touted the asbestos content of the talc. And then he found that as the dangers of asbestos became better known, the asbestos magically disappeared from Vanderbilt's talc, or at least from its marketing materials. The government finally could avoid the situation no longer. The Consumer Product Safety Commission did testing of its own, confirmed the presence of asbestos in the crayons, and immediately Binney & Smith promised to remove the substance they had denied was there. Vanderbilt quit mining talc in 2008, and last year, finally, a former Vanderbilt miner won a $10 million jury verdict. Today, another decade has passed, and we have the asbestos barons, just like the tobacco companies, fixing their eyes on emerging Asian markets, where regulation is all but non-existent and development is outpacing any other area of the planet. Their duplicity is reaching new heights. including the hiring of a corporate spy to surveil ADAO and other global ban asbestos organizations. It must be said that such outrageous action being taken against ADAO is an indication of the collective strength you have and how much ADAO is feared by the companies and their lackeys who are seeking to extend this global scourge. But journalists like me and dedicated organizations like ADAO must be more active than ever before because so much more work remains. For instance, the work of Australian publication New Matilda, which broke a detailed story identifying the Kazakhstan multinational company Custo Group, who hired K2 to spy on the anti-asbestos movement. There is the shameful epidemic of disease among teachers who work in asbestos-laden school environments. Teachers, those we entrust with the sacred duty of educating our children, and the children themselves, all remain at elevated risk of asbestos-related disease in many places across the world, and this must stop, perhaps most notably in the UK, where government's response has been too little, too late. And here in the United States, where we are constantly fed the propaganda of American exceptionalism, I am reminded of Dr. Barry Castleman's characterization of the Toxic Substances Control Act reform in Congress as the Catch Up with Croatia Act. A reference is to the fact that 55 plus countries across the world, including Croatia, have banned asbestos. The United States, as we know, is not yet among them. I was here in Washington for a time as bureau chief for Hearst Newspapers, and I went to some of the hearings on the TSCA reform bill. I was able to point out an interesting example of duplicity in the legislative process. I got a copy of the bill draft that was being circulated at the time by the offices of Senator Tom Udall and Senator David Vitter. It was touted as an example of bipartisan cooperation. And when I looked at the Word document properties of the bill, elaborately titled the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, the originating author was not Senator Udall's office or Senator Vitter's office. It showed up as the American Chemistry Council. The ACC is the leading trade organization and lobbyist for the chemical industry. While it's understood in Washington that lobbyists circulate red-line copies of bills and make suggestions to lawmakers, it struck me as particularly brazen that the author of this crucial draft legislation was the biggest lobbyist for the chemical industry. When I called the ACC about it, I was told by their spokeswoman and vice president, "You're not the first reporter to ask about this, and we've been able to raise enough questions about the authenticity of this that nobody else has written about it." So I asked if that was a denial that the bill was authored by the ACC, and she backpedaled. "I have no idea," she said. A Senate IT staffer took a look at the draft bill for Senator Barbara Boxer. His assessment, we can confidently say the document was created by a user at the American Chemistry Council. But after the efforts of ADAO, Senator Boxer, and others, when the Lautenberg Act was finally signed into law, it looked pretty promising. It established a protocol for 10 chemicals to be named by the EPA as the first to be evaluated for regulation. The evaluation of these chemicals is to be done under the Act within 3 years. And sure enough, in November of 2016, the EPA announced its list of the first 10. There were 4-dioxane, 1-bromopropane, carbon tetrachloride, cyclic aliphatic bromide cluster, methylene chloride, N-methylpyrrolidine, pigment violet 29, tetrachloroethane, trichloroethylene, and asbestos. What an amazing result. Let me tell you, the inclusion of asbestos on that list and the very existence of that list is a huge triumph for the Washington work of ADAO and Linda Reinstein. But something else happened in November of last year. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Donald Trump, who once tweeted that the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center might never have burned if we didn't remove incredibly powerful fire-retardant asbestos and replace it with junk. Of course, the great irony here is that as workers during the construction of the towers were applying a W.R. Grace product, Monocoat, to fireproof the steel beams of the building, asbestos public health pioneer Dr. Irving Selikoff sounded the alarm. He warned that there would be an epidemic of asbestos-related disease in lower Manhattan in 20 years if they kept spraying Monocoat into the air. Bowing to pressure, Grace reformulated Monocoat during the tower's construction, so the bottom floors of the towers were treated with the original formula, Monocoat, and the higher floors had the new, improved Monocoat, in which the chrysotile asbestos was removed and replaced with, you guessed it, vermiculite from W.R. Grace's mine in Libby, contaminated with the far more deadly tremolite asbestos. When the Trump Tower itself was under construction in the early 80s, construction workers sued Trump, saying they were forced to spray asbestos-containing fireproofing with no protective respirators. Trump denied knowledge of that, but settled the suit out of court. The president has said, "I believe that the movement against asbestos was led by the mob, because it was often mob-related companies that would do the asbestos removal. Great pressure was put on politicians, and as usual, the politicians relented." I have news for the president. The great pressure on politicians was exerted by the asbestos companies who have killed more people than the mob ever thought of rubbing out. And the toxicity of asbestos is not fake news. So now, the EPA, charged with evaluating asbestos as a step toward banning it, is run by a climate change denier, a science denier, who reports to the denier-in-chief, a man on record as denying the dangers of asbestos. How rigorous will that crippled agency's evaluation of asbestos be? Will the EPA, already reeling in the first 2 months of this president's term with a 32% recommended budget cut, be able to operate impartially in the face of the president's asbestos denial? The answer is yes, but only if we demand it, only if journalists do their jobs in the face of intimidation and hostility from this administration, and only if groups like ADAO stand up and resist the denial of science, resist the weakness and venality of politicians who are at the beck and call of the polluters and poisoners. Only if all of us stand up and tell Congress and the President we're not going to allow this country to keep looking the other way while 15,000 preventable asbestos tragedies occur every year, as if fulfilling an obscene, predetermined, government-sanctioned program of extermination, which is precisely what we face. Now is no time to quit. As anyone who has fought mesothelioma or watched a loved one do it knows, quitting is not to be contemplated. The government has for years quit on some of our most vulnerable citizens, those suffering from or at risk from asbestos-related disease. So we can't. We must spread the knowledge of these hazards so people will protect themselves. We must hold what remains of EPA and the rest of the federal government to account. And we must keep pushing for both a national and a global ban. Stephanie Harper endured 2 major surgeries. Strong chemicals to attack her cancer were introduced directly into her abdomen. But the pain continued, and doctors were unwilling to operate again. If it wasn't for asbestos, she said when I interviewed her 2 years before she died, my 14-year-old wouldn't have to drive me to the hospital in the middle of the night when I'm screaming in agony. That makes me angry. The entire time he and his family battled asbestos-related disease, Les Scramstad was angry too. He refused to settle his lawsuit against W.R. Grace and instead went to trial, and for the first time a jury in Libby found the company liable for damages. But the judge wouldn't force Grace to pay the judgment, so it didn't. And a year later, Les was forced to settle for far less than the jury gave him. As he grew sicker, Les said he didn't fear dying, but he feared the misery his wife and kids would experience from asbestos-related disease without him there to care for them. I'm angry, too. I'm angry for Les and for Stephanie and for all the other victims of this greed-caused disease. All of us must channel our anger and use it to fuel our fight. Power not used is power wasted. The power of the grassroots is to speak up, to demand the government of the people do the right thing for humankind, not for money-hungry corporations. The stakes have never been higher. If asbestos is allowed to proliferate across Asia, the global toll will be incalculable. And lagging countries like the United States, who are neither leading the international effort nor protecting their own citizens, must be forced to make morally defensible decisions. You are a key part of this. You are an integral part of a worldwide movement that will not be deterred. Please accept my admiration for your work and my wishes for your continued success. Thank you.
If you can't, you're going to anyhow. So, wasn't that a great talk? Wasn't I right? We have a luminary. He got our message out. Let's all say what he said. I'm angry, and we're going to do something about it. Say that. I want to hear you say, I'm angry. We're going to do something about it. That's what ADAO is about. We're going to get it banned. But now we have an opportunity to let David answer some questions. So we have about 10 minutes. David, anyone have a question?
And I'm an industrial hygienist, and we use your book as a guideline for trying to teach about the zonalite contamination throughout the country. And it's often cited that there's up to 15 million homes and properties that are potentially contaminated with this material. And I was just curious, where those numbers came from, the source to find that information. This just incredible number of properties that, and Americans and citizens that could be affected by this material.
You know, Tony, I suspect those numbers are understated, if anything. I think that they are originally based on estimates of the gross sales of Zonalite loose fill insulation, and you look at the aging process of the housing stock across the country and how many houses have gotten knocked down and how many remain. Obviously, you know, the very installation of that loose fill asbestos, I was looking in your display and saw the Bing Crosby endorsed attic rake to spread the Zonalite across the attic. So many people died from the single burst exposure of opening those bags and throwing the insulation across their attic floors. Once it sits there, it's relatively stable until a child crawls in the attic, until a cable installer comes up, until a remodel is done or a demolition is done, and then of course it becomes lethal. I still don't understand. Well, I understand. I still can't countenance the fact that the EPA, at the last second, literally, the press releases were already printed, backed off on an emergency health declaration for that material. It's still out there, and if you look at what's on the EPA's website in the way of warning people, it's pathetically inadequate.
Hello. Thank you for your work in this. I'm in communications, as I think some others of us are, or we all really are, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So thank you for your work, especially when we're talking to media and trying to get the message out about our cases, our clients. It's hard sometimes.
Yes.
What can you advise us all to do next from a communication standpoint? Give us some tips and some next steps.
Boy, don't quit. You know, I think for me and for Andy, you know, we understood this story on an intellectual level. One of the tough things about it was to understand how it could have been untold for so long. I mean, Grace was very efficient. When somebody would sue, they would settle, and the victim would sign a non-disclosure agreement and die. And it went on that way for a long time. And newspapers in Montana were told about it and didn't react well. I think what cemented our commitment to this story was not the intellectual knowledge of what was going on, but it was the personal knowledge. It was getting to know Gayla Benefield and getting to know Les Scramstad, Brad Black, and the heroes in Libby, Paul Peridard. And you know, when you see people going through the hell that Les went through, you know, knowing that his family had this awful disease that he had, he told me he loved his job so much at Zonalite that if they'd told him that he was endangering his own health, he might have stayed. But he said, if I'd known I was endangering my wife and my children, I would have run like hell. So Andy loved Les profoundly, and I did too. And getting to know people's story on that level, there's no substitute for it. And if you can get journalists to connect one-on-one with people, they'll be motivated to tell the story. And I just think that's the key.